a section of American history that is basically about industrial supremacy. We're going to go thematically again. We're talking about a large expanse of time. We're dealing with roughly the time period from the end of the Civil War to the beginning of the end rather, of the Spanish-American War. We're talking late 1890s, right at the turn of the century. I intentionally selected the term supremacy because we're talking about a time period where power is being exerted over all manner of things. You're exerting power over nature, people, economic systems, and in this time period the United States is really beginning to gather strength and become a true force as a nation, both at home and in the rest of the world. Products, and there are a couple of situations that make this progression in American society possible. And one of them is developments in the production of both iron and steel. These are two very different types of material, and they represent two very different eras, but these are the central construction and building components for naval vessels, buildings, armaments, machinery, that kind of thing. And if you look in this photograph here, you can see these men are actually pouring what's called pig iron, and you take the molten material and you pour it into these troughs in the floor, and it makes what's a kind of a rough rectangular ingot of metal, and that's much more easy to transport than just big hunks of slag. Steel itself is really a wonder product, and production is greatly increased in this time period, and steel is a much better building material than iron. Iron tends to be brittle, more brittle I should say. It's not the best material for making weapons, and steel is by far better. So what you end up with are a series of industrial processes that greatly speed up the ability of these factories, metal producing factories, to make the actual product. So you go from being able to produce, say, 300 tons a year of steel without the Bessemer process to being able to produce 10,000 tons of steel a week afterwards. You can see this is a great development in technology. And it's very true that the Bessemer converter process is an English invention, but it is put to greatest use and demonstration here in the United States. Very early steel plants are located in places like Pennsylvania, and these are really perfect geographic locations for these plants. It makes total sense because you've got huge belts of raw material in the form of coal, gigantic coal deposits in places like Pennsylvania and upper New York. And so this industry grows around that, and yet again, think back to the West. We're talking about resource extraction. You're taking material out of the environment and using that to promote industry and to build all of these materials that you need for nation building. And what happens with the growth of industry is that it produces wealth in a volume that has never been encountered before. Certainly not in American society. And this begins to concentrate power, both economic power and political power, social power even, in the hands of just a few people. And these people become just super wealthy. Ones that springs to mind as a successful example of these industrialists is Andrew Carnegie. And Carnegie makes his fortune with this new production of steel. He's also sensitive to the idea of the concentration of wealth in the hands of just a few people, and he actually writes a book called The Gospel of Wealth to try and grapple with some of these philosophical problems of having so much wealth. And the basic gist of The Gospel of Wealth is that the super rich have a moral obligation to the nation and to people to provide benevolence. And benevolence means support, or you can think of it like charity. So your modern church, your Catholic church or your Baptist church or whoever, they provide a certain amount of benevolence every year in the form of funds or care given to society. So part of what the benevolence that you see coming from the Carnegie family is the construction of libraries all over the United States. And these two buildings that you see here are actually libraries built during this time period right here in Georgia. And over his lifetime, Carnegie gave more than $70 million to public benevolence. And there's still foundations that carry his name that carry on philanthropic charity work to this very day. Very, very clear about the nature of the wealth that we're talking about. Benevolence is one thing, and yes, they're setting up foundations, they're doing philanthropic work, they're building libraries, they're managing all of these different charities. But the money that is being generated by these businesses is enough to purchase entire islands. Like the best example would be Carnegie's purchase of Cumberland Island off the coast of southeastern coast of Georgia. We're talking about an island that is 19 miles long, and it's basically used as a vacation home. Today it's a National Park Service site, and you can go there hiking and check out the beach. There's wild horses. But just imagine the kind of wealth that is necessary to buy a piece of real estate like this. The steel product that is being produced in these factories is going into every kind of construction conceivable. You're talking about architectural elements, basic consumer products, railway applications, and especially military applications, developments in weaponry and specifically ships, which will be very important in our next section. But look at the size of the pieces that these guys are working with in this photograph. And superimpose the guy on the left standing next to that chain, and you can just see how massive these elements that we're dealing with. And this is something you would never have been able to do with iron simply because of the weight and size involved, to say nothing about the actual integrity of the metal itself. Excellent figure is John D. Rockefeller. I'm absolutely certain that you heard this name before, and he makes a tremendous amount of money in the oil business. Rockefeller is still an important name and brand today, and we're dealing with gigantic amounts of money in the form of oil trusts. And he is an oil tycoon in the full sense of the word. He's the one that starts the first major and successful trust in the United States, and it's an oil trust, and I'll explain more about that in a second. But he also engages in philanthropic work, and over his lifetime provides more than $500 million in public benevolence. And the photograph on the left is the Rockefeller Building, which is in New York City. You can go take tours of this building, but again, you're talking about a tremendous amount of wealth. The idea of a trust is a little bit confusing, and so I want to make sure to go over it again. And Rockefeller is associated with the Standard Oil Trust founded in Ohio. At the time period we're talking about, oil is not a major fuel source like it is today. It's a source of chemical lubricants, and you have to have lots of different greases and different grade oils and lubricants to keep all this machinery of industrialization running. The significance of Standard Oil Trust is it's the first major trust. And the trust works because it's kind of like picture in your mind an umbrella or an octopus. And you've got many smaller companies that are producing the same product owned by a larger corporation or a larger company or entity. This is an example of what's called horizontal integration. In horizontal integration, you've got a company that owns many different companies, but they're all producing the same product. So you would have Standard Oil Trust, and it owns all of the mom and pop oil production companies underneath it. Small ones, medium ones, and even great big ones, but they're all under the control of Standard Oil. And this is what they mean by horizontal integration. And this political cartoon is great because it shows in graphic terms the potential for abuse in this system. Because you have the consolidation of so much capital and so much wealth and power in just one company, some people feel that it's a threat to democracy, and that's what's happening here. This kind of Kraken, Cthulhu type beast is wrapping its tentacles around the White House and the Capitol building, and it's a danger to democracy itself. And people begin to get very unsure, very uncomfortable with the amount of power and the scale, the sheer size of the trusts. And this has a lot of influence, or has a great impact when we get into the progressive era, which we'll be talking about soon. And part of this ultra-rich club is a guy named Cornelius Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt is much older than the others. The Rockefeller crowd do not like Vanderbilt. They consider him to be unrefined, less educated. The irony of that is that Vanderbilt is by far the most successful of the whole bunch, dollar-wise. And he makes all of his money through railroads and shipping, moving these products of horizontal integration back and forth, and making quite a bit of money during the Civil War as well. Wars are always good for business. And he makes enough money that he can provide benevolence in the foundation of Vanderbilt University, and then lots and lots of other donations. At the time of his death, if you calculated for time and inflation, Vanderbilt was worth $143 billion in today's currency. Have the kind of money that is almost comical in scale. When you're talking about money at this point, at this level, what can you really spend it on? And here you have Vanderbilt's private train. That's the actual engine is called the Commodore Vanderbilt, and you can see the arrow on the right hand side is pointing to a portrait of him painted on the lantern. His name's written on the side. This is absolutely no different than someone today buying a Ferrari and then having someone airbrush their face on the side or on the hood. It's that kind of an expression of just the unbelievable amount of money involved. The most significant of the lot is a guy named J.P. Morgan. And J.P. Morgan is significant because he makes major changes to the banking system. And when I say major changes, I mean in the physical process through which people handle money and handle banking. And through these changes, he makes just wild amounts of money. The kind of money that allows him to exert influence in politics. And this willingness to influence politics gets him into a lot of trouble later in the progressive era. We'll talk about that when we get there. But it's not just the accumulation of wealth, but it's also political power. And J.P. Morgan is so successful that we are still dealing with the company today. If you pull out the Visa card that's in your wallet right now and you look in the fine print, somewhere along the line, money from that Visa card passes through J.P. Morgan Chase. It's one of the central credit central places you can get credit in this country today, especially if you use Visa. And much like Carnegie and the others, Morgan is buying huge chunks of real estate right on the ocean. The famous one that he's involved with is Jekyll Island, and I'm sure you've heard of Jekyll Island. It's one of the most popular vacation destinations off the coast of Georgia right now. So hopefully you recognize the name Henry Ford, and I really can't give you a better example of a successful industrialist than Henry Ford. And generally, when you use the name Henry Ford, two things spring to mind. Number one, the Ford brand, the automotive brand, and number two, the assembly line. And while Henry Ford did not invent the assembly line, he's the one that put it to such tremendous effect. In the beginning, they're manufacturing a vehicle, the Model T, and it's around $600, which is very expensive for that time. And they introduced new tooling for the machining process, and it drops the price to $269. Henry Ford decides to pay his labor force more, doubles their pay to $5 a day, and you multiply that out over however many paychecks a year, and it makes his own vehicles affordable to even the working class American. Someone who's actually working in the factory building it can actually pay or afford to have one of these cars. And using this model, more than 50% of the cars sold in the United States in these early years are sold by Ford. Now, when he begins to lose market share to other manufacturers, he changes to the production of the Model A. And the Model A goes right on into the 1930s until he begins to lose market share yet again to GM and Chrysler. The Model A is a successful example of this industrialized. Builds a plant in Michigan called the River Rouge plant. And you can see industrialization really being applied to the production of consumer goods here. So if you look in this photograph, you can see there's a wheeled track, and people can use ropes to pull whole assemblies of vehicles along. So the arrow on the left is pointing at the rope, and you can see some of the extra wheels for lifting and moving the assemblies on the right-hand side. So the worker stays in a single position, and the assembly moves along. It makes the production of these vehicles much more efficient and much cheaper. And rapidly this process is accelerated. You can see in this photograph the rope operated assembly has been replaced with a mechanized process. If you look on the lower left underneath the frame of that vehicle, you can see a chain drive system. But not only is the assembly moving forward the vehicles, all of the parts are being delivered by assembly line as well. And you can see that indicated by the arrow. That's a huge conveyor of gigantic radiators. But it's also delivering wheels and everything that the workers need at their station. And now it's operating two sides. You can see a worker can stand on one side or the other. And if you got 2 tracks, you can add 3 tracks, and you can only increase your industrialization. River Rouge plant is gigantic. It's an example of what we call vertical integration. And vertical integration is where the company owns the entire process, literally from raw materials, from mineral resources coming out of the ground to the finished product. So instead of a company like in horizontal integration where the company owns all of the companies making the same product, in vertical integration, the company owns all of the means of production, all of the means of delivery, the mines that the raw material comes out of, the ships that deliver the finished product, everything from top to bottom. And you can see this in practice in this photograph. You can see right where the arrow indicates there's an ore ship that is delivering raw materials to the factory to be eventually turned into product. And somewhere over there on the left, eventually cars roll out of the assembly line for people to buy. Although it begins during the Civil War, the Transcontinental Railroad is a great example of one of these massive construction projects completed during this era. And they finished the Transcontinental Railroad on the 10th of May, 1869. It stretches from east to west, and it is certainly economically valuable moving of products back and forth. But what's almost as important is the demonstration aspect of this event. So an outside observer, someone in England or maybe Germany looking at this, is seeing a demonstration of both the technical and engineering prowess of the United States. So things like the Transcontinental Railroad become an example to the entire world of the progress of the United States. It's a projection of the United States power in terms of conquest of the environment and being able to harness and use industry to produce a product. So we've seen that the railroad, how instrumental it was in the quote-unquote conquest of the West. So there's many different things that are being said by this, and not all of these are something that is spoken outright, but it's an image. It's something that is understood by an outside observer. Another really great example is the completion of the Brooklyn Bridge. For its time, the Brooklyn Bridge is a technological marvel of engineering. It's the longest suspension bridge in the world when it's finished, and it's designed to handle traffic in the modern sense. Vehicular traffic, not just horses or people walking back and forth. It's designed looking forward into the future. The Brooklyn Bridge kind of falls into this same aura of projection of power that the railroads do. And this projection of power is going on at many different levels of society, but this expression of engineering and this expression of industrialization is helping the United States to begin to have an identity. People begin to express themselves as Americans. And not only that, but they're projecting an image of the United States other than just a wild frontier, a wilderness, or a place of gigantic agriculture. There's something very, very specific that is feeding into this system. And this is also unlike anything else in the world, anywhere else in the world. And we're talking about gigantic amounts of immigrants entering the United States at this time. And you can see these immigrants in this photograph. This is Ellis Island, which we'll talk more about in a second. But gigantic amounts of people are entering the United States. There are many, many different ports where people are actually entering the United States in this time period. And that's both coasts, East and West Coast, San Francisco, Boston Harbor. But we're going to talk mostly about New York City. It's the kind of classic example. And there's three very specific spots I want you to think about. And they're illustrated in this photograph. This is an overhead view of Lower Manhattan. The arrow that's on the top is pointing to Battery Park and a place called Castle Clinton. The arrow on the lower left is Ellis Island, and the lower right arrow is pointing to Liberty Island, which is the home of the Statue of Liberty. All right, these huge numbers of immigrants are arriving for a multitude of different reasons. In the case of the Irish, millions of Irish, it's famine brought on by a pestilence in the basic foodstuffs, a fungus that kills potatoes and turns everything to rot in the field. There's religious persecution. Lots and lots of Jews leave Tsarist Russia for the United States because they're being persecuted. There's ethnic cleansing in parts of Eastern Europe. People are escaping warfare. And then there's also just some people that come to the United States just for the sheer love of adventure. But there's really no single unifying reason why people come to the United States in this time period. When you enter New York Harbor by water, on your left, this is the first thing you see, or the port side for all you Navy people, but this is the first thing you'll see, the Statue of Liberty. And in the photograph, you can see people are cheering, raising their hats, and whether or not in this photograph they're just happy to see land again, or they're happy to see the Statue of Liberty, I mean, that's entirely up to your interpretation. But this joyful, celebratory image is absolutely the one we have in our mind when we think about immigrants coming to the United States. There's a glorious kind of story that revolves around this. In the 80s, the Disney made animated movies about little mice coming to the United States and singing and dancing and how happy they were. The problem with this tale, this glorious story, is that the reality, as is so often the case, doesn't necessarily match up to the hopes and dreams of all of these immigrants that are coming to the United States. And when I say millions, I mean it in the literal sense. Millions of people enter the United States. And the list that's on the left-hand side of this slide isn't even a partial list of the places where people originated from. But you can see from all of the photographs and the different number of places where we get this idea of what's called a great melting pot. And there is some real truth to this idea of the melting pot. There's a real stew of languages, culture, food, clothing styles, all of this going on in these ports where all of these people are coming together. I mean, just in these photographs here, there's people from Palestine, Albania, Germany, Ireland, people from all over. And just imagine just the sheer number of different languages that are trying to compete for space in places like New York. And so your immigrant, literally fresh off the boat, is confronted with something like this. This is a photograph of what's called Little Italy, and a lot of Italian immigrants come to this area, and mostly you get these groups of clusters of different cultures based upon language, and that should be of no surprise to you. People will seek out someone they can actually communicate with easily. But this is kind of a really good example of just the total chaos of a major city. I mean, if you spend time looking at this photograph, there's people doing everything is going on in here. Commerce, there's people playing games, there's kids wandering around in the street. It's just total chaos. And this problem that many of the immigrants don't speak English sets them up for a lot of problems. Some of them are naive or maybe too trusting. They're unsuspecting, and they fall victim to criminal gangs or con men. And there's a whole structure of people in New York City at this time that are preying on the newly minted Americans for either economic gain or just outright criminal enterprise, and they're called runners. And so a typical scam would be a runner would meet someone coming off the boat. They'd tell them, look, I'm going to help you get set up. I know a really cheap place for you to stay, and come with me. He speaks the language, so the guy trusts him. And he takes him to a boarding house, and they take his luggage and they store it for him, and he stays there looking for work. And then when he checks out of the boarding house, he's presented with a bill he can never pay. They charge him for the storage of his luggage. They charge him exorbitant amounts for his food, exorbitant amounts for the room. And so it indebts this new immigrant to someone who is part of a criminal gang or part of some other unsavory business. A lot of women that get caught up into this end up in prostitution. They fall victims to pimps. And this is through no fault of their own. It's just a function of entering this new ecosystem with all of these new cultural norms. Well, being the recipient of by far the bulk of immigrants entering the United States, the city of New York is keen to put an end to this problem of the abuse of the immigrants. So the city of New York opens up an immigrant processing station at a place, it's actually an old fort. It's called Castle Clinton in Battery Park, and you can see it on the lower left. And this is the site of this is also near, I should say, the site of or former site of the World Trade Center towers. They're on the upper left, and you can see the Brooklyn Bridge on the right-hand side. So Castle Clinton is right here at the very tip of Manhattan, but it is on the island. It's not really separated. It was at one time, but landfill has filled in the area around it, and this is where they chose to locate this processing center. Beginning on the 1st of August in 1855, the city of New York began to process immigrants through Castle Clinton. This is the first kind of immigrant processing facility of this kind anywhere. And something to the tune of 8 to 12 million people passed through this structure by barge. The ship would unload people to barges and then take them to the processing center. Between 1855 and 1890, 8 to 12 million people, and then the facility closes. And we're not really sure exactly the figures. That's why I say 8 to 12 million. And this is because most of the records from Castle Clinton were lost in a big fire in 1897. They closed Castle Clinton in 1890, but after 1890, the site serves as an aquarium. Actually, for quite a few years, it was the aquarium, it was a theater, and it's now been restored to its military original fort condition and is under control of the National Park Service. And they did that restoration in the 1970s. So this is being protected as a heritage site by the National Park Service. Now, because of the huge number of immigrants that are coming in, the size of this pilgrimage, and some really bad episodes of corruption in the organization of Castle Clinton, which was called Castle Garden, by the way, at that time, New York City decides to transfer the operation, the immigrant operation, to the actual United States government. And the United States government wants to open a brand new facility, and they choose what is nearby Ellis Island to open the immigrant facility, processing facility in 1892. Ellis Island was originally known as Gibbet Island, and a gibbet is like a gallows, only larger. A gibbet is a place of public execution. And the best example I can give you of that is that opening scene of, one of the early scenes rather, in the first Pirates of the Caribbean movie, where the dead pirates are hanging out and there's the sign. The idea is they would be hanged in public as a warning. And that's what they used this island for before it became Ellis Island. And the way it becomes Ellis Island is it passes through different ownerships to a man named Ellis, and then the city and state of New York claim it for their own use. And there's a large facility constructed on Ellis Island, and most of Ellis Island is actually reclaimed dirt. It's fill that's been dumped with bulkheads. So that's why everything has kind of got a rigid square shape, is that it's backfill. But ships dock and they disgorge people into this main building. And once inside this main building, they're cataloged, interviewed, inspected. They can be hospitalized, incarcerated, or granted admittance into the United States. And in the lower left arrow, you can see this photograph. And this is a later photograph. I just show you because it's a very good aerial photograph. The lower left arrow is indicating a ship which is docked. You can see the tug is holding it to the dock, and so new immigrants are actually passing into the intake building in this photograph. The upper arrow shows the main building with the grand hall and the processing area. Here are some before and after photographs of the grand hall on Ellis Island. In the left-hand photograph, you can see people are lined up in long lines, almost like cattle runs, just like waiting outside It's a Small World at Disney in the middle of August, peak season. They're just jammed in there like sheep. Much like Castle Clinton, Ellis Island is now a National Park Service site, and in the time that it was in operation as a immigrant processing facility, more than 12 million new Americans passed through this room. And we're talking the years 1892 to 1954 when it finally closed. This is the floor plan map of Ellis Island. And on the right-hand side is the main building and the dock. On the left-hand side are the hospitals and the infectious disease wards. The far left arrow would be infectious disease wards for isolating people with tuberculosis or some kind of other communicable disease. And then the arrow that's in the middle, those are the main hospital buildings. And so many immigrants found themselves not on a ferry to New York City, but they found themselves held in these hospitals or infectious disease wards. Sometimes they were there for months, sometimes they were there for years. And the left side, the east side of Ellis Island is not open to the public. Depending on how adventurous you are, you can still get over there and tour some of the hospital wards, but some of the roofs have collapsed and the windows are smashed out, and it's like something out of your basic run-of-the-mill horror movie. It's pretty much nightmare fuel over there. But there is an interesting part of the story here that the National Park Service has chosen to fixate on the story of the kind of triumphal story of immigrants coming to the United States, being processed through the Grand Hall, going on to New York, and participating in this kind of rags to riches story of immigrants coming to the United States. And there's been the intentional kind of, if you will, ignoring the whole east side of the island with some of the more unsavory aspects of the immigrant experience. And hopefully they'll cut down all the vines and trees someday and repair some of the buildings and open it all up so that people can get a really good flavor for the whole immigrant experience. And that having been said, Castle Clinton and Ellis Island were designed to prevent abuses of immigrants coming to the United States. It industrialized the process of immigrant induction, very nicely did away with the problem of runners, and helped to fight the predations from pimps and criminals and everything else. But what doesn't happen, significantly what doesn't happen, is it does nothing to deal with the huge imbalance of lifestyle in this industrialized era. So your poor remain desperately poor, while some people, your industrialists, get rich enough to buy pieces of real estate that are visible from space. So there's conflict with the general narrative that we hold in our mind of the immigrant experience. This idea of the self-made man comes from Europe with nothing and then proves himself through his own ideas and willingness to work. There's still a huge imbalance in personal experience of the immigrants coming to this country. And the immigrants are providing the basic bulk of the workforce that is driving the industrial process. The people that are manufacturing these new materials and building these new bridges and putting together these new rail lines and building the naval vessels of another era, of the next era, I should say. This is done with a lot of immigrant labor.